I've got a screen full of people. This is great to see. Rachel, I didn't check with you. Have you got you've got slides that you're going to, you can share them and handle it from your end. Yep, great. Perfect. Okay. Welcome everybody to this seminar on carers, how we can better support carers. My name's Jenny Fitzharding. I'm one of the volunteer family connections leaders, and I am a clinical counsellor in private practice. And I'm just here to introduce and sort of help facilitate some of the questions at the end. And I just want to acknowledge that we are all meeting on Aboriginal lands. I'm on Whadjuk Noongar country, which is Perth or Burrulu, Western Australia. And I just wanted to acknowledge all the elders, past, present and future, that are hopefully helping to guide us towards a better future. And I also want to acknowledge that we've got Megan Henderson, who's the CEO of NEA BPD here today, and also Stan Rogers, who's our General Manager. And I just wanted to say thank you all for coming today, and for those of you that could afford to donate, for donating and supporting us. We are an organisation that is very, very much run on volunteer power, and we don't get any government funding. So everything that is donated goes towards the runnings of the programs. The Family Connections programs, which we run, take 12 weeks, and we can, it costs $250 to put one adult through a 12-week program. So it's an excellent return on investment, but we do need support to do the administrative support that we get from Kylie, who I haven't acknowledged, but I should have, because she is a one-woman band that maintains all the requests for support that come in, and supports the other organisations that deliver our programs as well. So just a little shout out to her. Okay, and now I'd love to introduce Dr. Rachel Bailey. She's a clinical psychologist, senior research fellow, and implementation coordinator with Project AIR strategy for personality disorders. Project AIR is a research and implementation program based out of the University of Wollongong. And they've got fantastic resources on their website, which I, as a clinician, have used a lot and have directed a lot of families to. So do go and check out their website. Rachel completed her PhD in 2014 with the Project AIR strategy, focusing on the experience and support needs of families and carers of people with lived experience of personality disorder. She then went on to enhance her clinical skills by working in private practice, public outpatient, inpatient, and forensic settings. During this time, Rachel completed comprehensive training in dialectical behaviour therapy and continued to develop an interest in both the research and clinical treatment of people with personality disorders and associated conditions. Rachel returned to Project AIR strategy in 2021 to further pursue her passion in contributing to the evidence base and best practice in understanding and treating personality disorders and related issues, identity, attachment, complex trauma, grief, forensic, and supporting families and carers. So we're really lucky to have someone with so much experience and clinical know-how and research evidence behind her. So I'm going to hand over to her. Oh, but sorry, just before I do, if there are any questions, I will collect them all up and we'll ask them at the end.
Well, thank you for that very warm welcome, and I'm very excited to spend some time with you all this morning. And I do have some slides to share, so let's see if I can get them up and running. Okay. Well, now hopefully you can all see those slides and you can all hear me okay. Certainly if you can't hear me or you can't see what I'm referring to, please just let me know. But again, thank you for that warm welcome. So again, I'm Dr. Rachel Bailey, a clinical psychologist and senior research fellow at Project AIR. And I'm grateful to be on the call with you all today and certainly recognise all the wisdom in the room from various different paths and walks of life and lived experience journeys. So this talk that I'll be working through today is really titled Supporting Those Who Support Others. I'll be primarily looking and kind of walking through the Project AIR journey of the research behind what we've done in this space and the research that we're continuing to do and some of the resources that we're continuing to develop. And of course, there's my contact details there should you wish to get in touch at any point in time. So I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we're all meeting today. The Project AIR is based on the beautiful Dharawal country in Wollongong. But of course, extending my respect to wherever you're joining from today, and certainly those as well who might be viewing this webinar later on as a recording. And paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and a particular warm welcome to anyone here with Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander or First Nations background. And of course, again, I'm just acknowledging that there's so much lived experience wisdom on the call here today, and certainly acknowledging that and recognising that, but also those with lived experience who have contributed to the work at Project AIR, including some of which I'll be presenting today. Of course, it is through the wisdom of yourselves as experts that we can improve what we do, and certainly that is part of the passion at Project AIR. As I go throughout my presentation today, I will be using some terms interchangeably, and I recognise that language is such an important part of how we perceive ourselves and our roles in the world and our place amongst each other. And some of these terms may resonate with you and some may not, and it's certainly not intended to be offensive. So I'm just kind of acknowledging that, for instance, the term carer may not suit individuals on the call or watching the webinar later. Certainly I might use that term from time to time, but I might use support person or partner. Please, if there's a term that I use that doesn't resonate with you, please just interchange that with another that does. It's certainly not intended to be disrespectful, but do recognizing that we're all different and we all resonate with different terms for our own personal journey. So some of the information that I'll be going through today may not be new for some of you. Some of it might be new. Certainly I'll be talking a little bit about Project AIR. Now I know you've had my beautiful colleague Sophie Lucas on the call before, so you know a little bit already. But I would like just to touch on what Project AIR is for those who aren't so aware. And then I'll be talking a little bit about the literature. And again, that might not be necessarily new information for some, but it might be for others. So I'll just kind of touch on that and then look at some of the gaps that, you know, from a research perspective, we've identified that we need to do better. But I'd certainly be very interested in the wisdom of the group here today to understand some of the gaps that you've identified as well. And I'll also be talking a little bit about a new resource that we've developed. So that might be new for some of you, many of you on the call. So that might be new and exciting. So Project AIR is a partnership with the University of Wollongong. We're based out of the beautiful grounds there, but we certainly don't spend a huge amount of time there. We are often in health services, trying to work alongside clinicians and mental health services to redesign perhaps and generate really personality disorder friendly services and referral pathways. And we have a number of supporters. This is just a little hat tip to those, I suppose, you know, primarily through the New South Wales Ministry of Health and also Queensland Health, but we've had a number of others as well, and just acknowledging those. And also acknowledging that the Project AIR really rests on a whole body of minds that have contributed to the work over time, and the wisdom of these people certainly lingers on, and including in some of the material that I'll be covering today. So just recognizing, of course, that we have a large team and acknowledging all of their wisdom that's contributed to the work. And also our experts, our project consultants that have also contributed to our work over time. So those with lived and living experience, both from a consumer perspective and a family member or carer perspective as well. And certainly have contributed to some of the work that I'll be presenting on today, and continue to contribute to Project AIR and the work in which we do on a daily basis. So a really strong and warm acknowledgement to those expert individuals. If you haven't already, we do have a website. It would be lovely for you to go and visit us at our website if you haven't already. Our website is really a host. It's got a wealth of information on there, and it was lovely of Jenny to mention that she has utilised the resources on that space. Certainly it's all free for access, free resources that are available on our website. We have a number of different doors that individuals can go through to identify resources that might be most suitable for them and their role and their journey. Certainly, we have doors around perhaps a family carer role. And within there, we've got a bunch of resources and hopeful and helpful lived experience stories. But we've certainly got other doors as well, and we do welcome you to go and have a look at all of those resources. We're constantly updating. So, of course, again, this might not be new to everybody here on the call, because we are all here because we are passionate about personality disorders being a mental health priority area. This is a paper that we published in partnership with some other wonderful colleagues back in 2017, recognising, I suppose, that historically, perhaps we haven't done so well as a health service in supporting people with personality disorders and their families as well that come along for support and information. And certainly this is part of the story in us really promoting that it is a mental health priority area. And you'll see that there's a number of different, this is just the brief abstract I've included here, but there's a number of different parts to the story that are still a mental health priority area. Of course, service provision, and of course, different aspects to that, including things like early intervention. But you'll also see as well that it's really important for us to be considering the lived experience perspective, including those in a care or family kind of role, those supporting others. And I think that there's still room for us to improve in that space. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along today. So Project AIR is a whole of service stepped care approach. It's a bit of a mouthful, but what we are saying here is that we are really passionate and recognise that people with personality disorders and their families really do knock on a variety of doors in the health service at times. And we believe that it's everyone's responsibility in the health service to respond well to people with personality disorders and their families. And we try to take a really holistic way of working to improve the ways in which health services work with people with personality disorders and their families. And part of that is, as I mentioned before, really thinking about service redesign. So we spend a lot of time in health services doing things like training, but also working alongside the health service, trying to redefine treatment pathways and referral options, perhaps stepped approaches, which I'll speak more to as we go through today, that really do match the intensity of the intervention with the need of the individual, really kind of trying to take a person-centered approach. We're constantly evaluating what we do, and I'll show you a little bit of that as we go through today, of course. We're often connecting with families, carers and consumers, and of course part of today is an opportunity to do that, so I'm very grateful to be connecting with you all today. But we've got a variety of other ways in which we do that too. We also recognise that really the overarching narrative around personality disorders needs to be shifted within the general community as well. And so we have ways in which we try to approach that too, just from a general providing accurate information perspective. And there's particular projects in which we do as well, where we're working with health services to really enhance the clinical services that they provide. So we work strongly with health services to try and promote evidence-based best practice care. So I'll move now to talk about some of the literature. And again, I'll really focus quite a lot on the Project AIR journey in this space, but I'll also integrate some of the other research that's come out in this space too, recognizing, of course, that there's a number of wonderful minds contributing to the research around people who support family members with personality disorder. And there's a number of wonderful organizations that contribute to this space too. So of course, Project AIR leans into this space, but NEA BPD, again, is a wonderful organization that has a wealth of knowledge in this area too. And there's many others as well. So our journey, thinking about the family and carer journey, really started in the very early days of Project AIR. So Project AIR really started around 2010, perhaps a little bit before that with some planting of seeds. But we really started by thinking and talking to family members and carers about their experience and recognizing that there actually wasn't much in the literature at the time, which was very different actually to perhaps family members and carers of people with other mental illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar. There was kind of a really maturing wealth of evidence base around those family members and carers, but really nothing so much in terms of family members and carers of people with personality disorder. And I think that really reflects, that the research was really lacking just in this area in general. And so the first thing we do was what we call a systematic review. So we thought to ourselves, we kind of need to do a bit of a summary of where things are up to now so that we can understand what's already been done, and we can understand what some of the gaps are where we need to improve our research and understanding. And so systematic review is fundamentally kind of where you put in some search terms into an academic journal database, and it comes back with lots of different hits, and you sift through them and you find the articles that are really kind of hitting home for what you're trying to look at. And so when we did that, we found 6 articles that had been done, which was actually really positive, but of course we need many, many more. And 5 of those were really focused on looking at the experience of families and carers of people with borderline personality disorder. And we got all of that data and we lumped it all together, and it ended up being a sample size of about 465 carers. And again, this is perhaps not new information to you, but perhaps might echo or reflect some of your experience, or perhaps for those who are watching this later, this might be new information. But what we found was that family members and carers were really identifying that they were experiencing a lot of kind of what we call burden, and that's not meant as a pejorative term here. It's kind of meaning that, of course, that there's an emotional aspect to this caregiving role, of course, and it does kind of take a toll, both in terms of your own well-being, but also in terms of, your time and your resources and your finances and taking people to appointments or paying for treatment and things that, of course, will all have an effect as well. So lots of that kind of going on. Significantly lower levels of what we call empowerment. And this was really looking at things like feeling like they were able to navigate the health service in a way that felt kind of easy and seamless. That was quite a challenge. And that was compared to family members and carers of people with other kind of really serious mental illnesses too, like schizophrenia and bipolar. So really kind of demonstrating lots of concerns in those spaces. And that they were experiencing symptoms consistent with their own mental health kind of concerns, which makes sense to me if, you're supporting someone who's struggling, that sometimes, of course, that can have an impact on you as well. And then we did a follow-up survey where we surveyed about just nearly 300 family members and carers, and this kind of echoed some of that. So again, quite high levels of burden compared to people with other carers of people with other mental illnesses and concerns, and symptoms consistent with depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress, which again makes sense to me from a very human perspective when family members and carers can often maybe find themselves in very trying and tricky circumstances with people they love very dearly. So this was kind of the start of the journey for us. And then we moved on to think about, okay, well, what about the relationship then? Like, what's actually going on between the the family member, the person that's providing that support, and the person that's actually struggling with the personality disorder, what's going on there. And the reason we looked into this is because there was this lovely paper by Julian Hoffman back in 1999. And of course, you might recall the name Hoffman, Perry Hoffman, who was kind of the mother really of thinking about the importance of family members and carers in this space, and a real legacy. So what they did was they did a study looking at what they call expressed emotion. So this is kind of a construct we use in research sometimes, and they're really kind of focusing on this element of what they call emotional over-involvement. So this is kind of where perhaps family members and carers, or if this is sometimes extended into parenting research too. So might find themselves really concerned, might find themselves really leaning into supporting their loved one, perhaps to the degree where they might lose themselves a little bit in that way, that they feel like they're constantly putting out fires, and that they actually can't take the time to take care of themselves, like that real over kind of investment. And again, that makes sense to me why someone would get caught in that pattern. But what they found was that there've been a whole body of research that when family members kind of get caught up in this over-involvement way of relating to their loved one with other serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar, it actually corresponds to worse outcomes for the consumer in those groups. So they might experience more symptoms or more distress, or end up at the emergency department more often. But conversely, for people with personality disorder, what they found was that when family members and carers really leaned into this emotional over-involvement pattern, they actually found that the person with borderline personality disorder had somewhat improved outcomes, perhaps lower levels of symptoms or distress, less presentations to the emergency department. And what they thought was that maybe for this particular group, that over-involvement might be perceived by their loved one as real validation of their suffering and struggle, and that the person that supports me can really see how much pain that I'm in and really takes that seriously. But what we found in this study is that when you look at that emotional over-involvement from the lens of the carer, it's actually associated with worse outcomes for the carer in terms of their well-being and their kind of levels of burden. So this creates a little bit of a conundrum here, where this over-involvement might actually be in some ways beneficial for the loved one, but understandably might actually kind of lean into difficulties for the carer in terms of managing their own well-being as well. And so there's this real dance that kind of happens perhaps with family members, where it's difficult to know when to step in and when to step back out again, and when to kind of lean into providing perhaps a bit of extra care and involvement, when to step back and allow their loved one to take some agency in their life. And again, that makes sense to me. But it does create this kind of conundrum, this bit of a dilemma. And so we thought that was really interesting. And of course, we're thinking then about, well, how can we support family members and carers to be emotionally involved, to actually, remain validating and supportive and soothing without, I suppose, losing themselves in that space as well. And so we moved on to create a support intervention, for want of a better word, for family members and carers. And at the time, this was quite new in Australia. At the time, Family Connections hadn't really come out to Australia. Anne Reeve certainly brought that out perhaps in around 2014 and things. I know this paper was published in about 2018, but this work was actually being done quite a few years prior to that. Around 2013, 2014, we were piloting this particular intervention. And what it was a one-day workshop followed by 4 two-hour groups. So it's actually relatively brief. And we did what we call a randomized control trial. Now, that's kind of in research terms when you're looking at whether an intervention as such is effective. That's one of the gold standard ways of looking at it, because we take a bunch of carers who had consented to the research and we randomly allocate those carers, some to receive the intervention and some to wait and then receive the intervention later. And of course, if they were coming as part of a group, like a mum and a dad, or a sister and a dad in support of someone else in their family, that they would be together, they wouldn't be split up. But that's kind of how they were randomized. And what we found was that even this kind of quite brief group, really, when we asked them to complete some measures pre and post, it actually improved the quality of their relationship with their loved one. It reduced that emotional over-involvement and also criticism, which is another aspect of expressed emotion that's sometimes looked at, and increased their sense of empowerment. And those improvements were sustained over 12 months. And then interestingly, when we asked them again about how they were going at 12 months, some of the other measures changed at that point. So their burden items kind of changed significantly and their mental health improved, which kind of tells us that sometimes, like, it might take a bit longer for those kinds of parts of well-being to improve over time. Change doesn't happen overnight, of course. So this was really positive. And this is the sort of feedback that we received. And really the striking thing for us was that family members and carers to this point perhaps hadn't actually felt as though they'd been taken seriously and felt as though they were able to access others in the community that were in a similar situation to them and kind of see themselves reflected in that sort of way, which was really positive. And there was kind of lots of quotes on that the group was helpful. But of course, recognizing that since then, the field has matured a whole lot. And that has also included the wonderful work of Family Connections and thinking about how Family Connections has found ways to think about different ways of connecting with family members and carers as well. So for instance, using smartphones and thinking about different ways of connecting, which is wonderful. So just recognizing that this isn't, of course, the only intervention. There's lots available, including Family Connections. And so, of course, again, some colleagues from different labs decided it would be good at about 2020 to take another summary of where things were up to. And there was actually 2 systematic reviews that came out around about the same time. They both identified the same number of studies, but actually, interestingly, quite slightly different studies, but really echoed the same sorts of findings, which was that interventions that had been developed to support family members and carers, including the one that I spoke about from our lab, but also including Family Connections, of course, were showing real promise in supporting family members and carers. Again, this probably isn't new for you all, but certainly that there's a lot of gaps that we've got still a long way to go in enhancing our research in this space. The field has a lot of room to mature. And this was the second one that came around the same time, so again in 2020. But the interesting takeaway message that I find from this one is, again, it's echoing the same kind of findings, that these support programs are really kind of useful in a variety of different ways. But what we don't know yet, and this is kind of where the field, I think, has some room for maturity, certainly, is we don't actually know what about these support groups is most beneficial. What is it perhaps that these support interventions offer information? Is that kind of a real key ingredient? Is it that they provide skills? Is that a key ingredient? Or is it that we provide support? So the mechanism for change is really unclear at this point. And it might be that all 3 of those are required, of course, but it might be that for some carers or family members, they don't need all 3 at this point in time. They might only need a few of those. Or, like, what actually is the mechanism? We just don't know. So in terms of the information, again, Hoffman and her colleagues did a beautiful study that actually showed that sometimes providing more information, and this was many moons ago, where a lot of the information that was available on corners of the internet were very inaccurate, very unhelpful, and very unhopeful. That actually, well, it kind of makes sense that would increase family member and carers' distress if that's what they were accessing. And of course, it's not accurate either. And lack of information perpetuates this sense of disempowerment. Because if we don't know what we're trying to how we're trying to support someone, then it makes it very difficult. So of course, just providing information could be really beneficial. And there's been some work where just a single day workshop that's primarily focused on just providing accurate, hopeful information can be beneficial. And very brief online modules where there's no access to support and it's just based on information, not necessarily interweaving skills, has also been found to be very beneficial. So for some family members and carers, maybe information is kind of the key for what they need at this particular point in their journey. But of course, we recognise that some carers want skills. That information is wonderful to know, but actually want to know how to also be more skillful in the relationship and reconnect. And of course, Family Connections does a wonderful job in this space with a variety of different kind of communication skills and relationship management skills, crisis management skills, etc. And also, and I know again, self-care can be a bit of a contentious kind of concept and term at times, especially when we are struggling to in that step in, step back dance. Certainly, though, even just kind of single session kind of interventions where we're working on self-care that's values-based can also be very beneficial. But then, of course, some carers do want to connect with others. And again, this is a wonderful space that Family Connections does so well, because of course you've got the group connecting with each other, but you've also got the facilitator with the lived experience too. Because of course, what we know is that some families, when they're kind of caught in this space, might actually withdraw from some of those supports that they might have otherwise found to be soothing. And they might feel very isolated then. And so to kind of combat some of that, maybe it would be around the support, the peer support component that would be really beneficial. Whereas others have said in the research that they actually want one-to-one support with a clinician, that perhaps at this point in their journey, they're not quite ready for that yet, but maybe they would be later on. So again, the key takeaway message here is, of course, these interventions are doing wonderful things and providing such a powerful experience for those in the community who are otherwise kind of struggling. But we need to know more. We need to know more about what's working and how to enhance these sorts of support options. And so where to from here? So again, there's lots of room for maturity, but the field around personality disorders is also maturing. So, and I think there might be some kind of transferable ideas that might be useful from just the field of personality disorders into the space of family members and carers. And I'd be interested to hear your reflections here too. So I mentioned earlier this idea about stepped care. So the field around personality disorder treatment for the client is really moving and maturing. So of course, as you know, back in the 1990s, the first randomized controlled trials for the treatment of in particular borderline personality disorder came out, and they were a real beacon of hope that we actually can do things in this space that are meaningful and effective. And those were around dialectical behaviour therapy, but also around the conversational model, which was born here in Australia, which is really exciting. But they were really intensive long-term models. So the field is actually maturing from there to try to understand, well, perhaps some people do and would benefit from and are ready and willing and able to engage in those really long-term intensive models, like DBT for 1 to 2 years, both group and individual every week. But perhaps on a person-centered basis, some individuals may not want or be ready or be willing for that. And maybe they might benefit from just the group aspect or just an individual aspect or a shorter kind of version. And so the field is really moving to think about stepped care options, trying to meet the level of intensity of need for that individual with the level of intensity of the intervention. And then, of course, stepping up or stepping down in collaborative conversations with that individual. And so the idea of stepped care is something that might fit within the family carer space as well. But the field is also moving in terms of thinking about, well, what is personality disorder diagnostically? Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail here around this because I think this is a whole training in and of itself in many ways. But what we had previously was what we call categorical diagnosis. So you might be familiar, for instance, with, borderline personality disorder, but then we also had antisocial, and we also had avoidant personality disorder and narcissistic personality, and these categories of personality disorder that a bunch of people that came together many moons ago kind of decided were discrete personality disorders, and someone would need to meet a certain amount of symptoms to meet criteria. But what we know is that oftentimes people might actually meet a few of those. They might be what we call comorbidity. They might meet a few of those personality disorder diagnoses. Or they might meet a primary diagnosis, have flavors of others. And so the field is actually moving more towards the idea of a dimensional model of personality disorder. That perhaps someone would meet criteria of personality disorder, yes or no. And if yes, what's the severity? Is it mild, moderate, or severe? And then perhaps some qualifiers, I suppose, on what are the flavors. And that might be where you would be able to say it's a little bit more antisocial, a little bit more BPD. And I think these ideas are important because what we know is that carers of people who support those with a personality disorder are diverse, just as everyone is diverse in the community. And certainly I've spoke to those who support others who, yes, might have a borderline personality disorder diagnosis, but may also have others as well. And that might look slightly different for different individuals. And even within the borderline realm, of course, we know there's many, many, many ways that someone might receive that categorical diagnosis. And so it might be important for us to think in terms of the broader personality disorder people who support those with broader personality disorders, to think about how we can support those as well and be inclusive and think about the diversity in that space. I don't think we've done too well in thinking about the different needs for different relationships. Certainly, we've leaned into that in the research a few times. Some of the research that I spoke about earlier from our lab tried to look at some of that, but it's actually been really quite challenging. And I'd be interested to hear those on the call what you think about this. But are there differences in terms of what families need if they're coming from the role of being perhaps a parent to an adult child versus a partner, versus a sibling, versus a friend, or is that the same? We just actually don't know. That hasn't been assessed very well in the literature so far. And of course, thinking about younger carers, what might their support needs be versus adult support people versus those in the older years, in the twilight years of their life that they might have imagined would look wildly different to how it looks now, because they're still in that very supportive, very important, very involved role. Do they have slightly different needs too, considering that they might have other kind of concerns going on in their life? So again, I think there's just a lot of room for improvement in the research kind of side of things. And these are just a few studies from our lab, just to kind of say that colleagues are looking into the experience of family members and carers of people with other personality disorders. So these are a couple from a colleague who looked at narcissism, for instance, but we haven't done too good of a job looking at some of the others. And again, thinking about that dimensional model as well. I mentioned stepped options for carers. Certainly, I think some of the research is leaning into this space, but I think we could possibly lean in a little bit more. Just as an example, of course, family connections is 12 weeks. Certainly, the intervention I spoke about earlier is more like, say, 4 sessions. But there's also been research to look at even briefer, so a 3-session psychoeducational group showed really positive kind of results. There's been some online options that have been looked at. So an online moderated program was shown to reduce burden, stress, and improve that expressed emotion like I talked about before. And then interestingly, there was an RCT recently that looked at, so again, randomized controlled trial, that's where we randomize participants to different groups. One group received just a psychoeducational group program. So just the psychoeducational aspect. The psychoeducation is just information fundamentally. Plus 2 online modules. So they received, I suppose, in some ways, the support component because they were in a group, the information component, and there would have been the possibility of some skills, versus just the online module. So just information, not really the support, not really leaning into the skills so much. And both of those showed pretty equal amounts of positive change. So that, again, that's really interesting, thinking about what's the key mechanism here. Is it we need information, we need skills, we need support? Do we need a combination of those? And I think that's going to be different for different individuals. And of course, thinking about what's going to work for you and your family at this particular point in your journey might be very different to if we ask you again in 5 years' time, or we asked you 5 years ago. That some might be at the stage where they just need some basic information. Perhaps they just need to clarify what's going on, and that then can digest some of that and think it through. Some might really just want to connect and have peer support and really kind of be able to share with those with a similar lived experience. Some may want briefer options, and some may want longer term options. Some may want just one-to-one with a clinician, and some might want online options. Like, I think it's very unique to different spaces and places and different carers and individuals and their needs. The other future directions is, again, thinking about personality disorders more broadly, and how even those with borderline personality disorder can look very unique and suffer and struggle in very unique ways, just by the way that the diagnosis is made. But then how the field is moving towards the dimensional model and what that's going to mean and look like as well. And how we can support family members who might be struggling and suffering with other flavors as well, and think about being inclusive. I don't know that we've done too great a job in terms of being global. Family Connections is wonderful. I know it's available in so many different countries now, but certainly I think there's probably some carers in some countries that are struggling perhaps to access support, even if it's just information, as an example, to feel as though that there is something out there that makes sense of their experience. And whilst I'm a passionate advocate that it's beneficial of its own for family members and carers to receive their own support, just because you're important on your own as an individual, your well-being is important just as is. The million-dollar question that remains in the research is, does providing these supports to the family members and carers actually improve things for the client or the consumer? That's the million-dollar question that we just don't know. So I'm going to lean in now briefly to talk about a new resource that we have developed at Project AIR. That this might be the exciting part that might be new for some of you, but it might not too. So this is fundamentally leaning into that information and skills part. Certainly this is an e-learning that's available. It's 6 modules free. Anyone can access it anytime. We do provide some videos in there of people with lived experience, so carers talking. So it does provide a little bit of feeling as though people are connected, but it doesn't provide any other connection other than that. So it's really leaning into the information skills part because it is an online e-learning program. And I'm just going to give you a little taster of what that actually looks like and involves. And kind of one of the key things that we look at in this e-learning, which is very much based on the intervention that I spoke about earlier, but we've kind of rejigged it a little bit to make it e-learning friendly, is the idea of relationship dances. This is this step in, step back that we spoke about before, and trying to find ways to navigate that in a way that's both helpful for the carer and helpful for the person that the carer loves, the support person loves as well. That relationships can be like a dance. At times we step in, at times we step back, and we all can get caught up in different relationship dances that can be helpful or unhelpful at times. We get very used to taking certain steps in relationships, but I think sometimes what family members have told me is that sometimes they've actually spent a very long time in this kind of fight, flight, freeze state. And so finding the space to slow down and think and reflect on what's working and what's not working hasn't been something that they've had the opportunity perhaps for a while to be able to do. So it's really thinking about that. And if you look at the e-learning today, you would find that some of the names of these are slightly different. And that's because we've been asked to consider how to adapt the current model to explain this a little bit more. So you might see a little bit of difference here, but fundamentally the ideas are the same. So this is the idea about this whole idea about stepping in, but perhaps in a way where you feel the urge to jump in. You might be problem solving because you're seeing your loved one struggle, and that kind of makes sense. You might feel as though your loved one is helpless in this moment and you need to do that. And of course, that can be helpful in the short term. But if this dance gets if you get caught up in this dance, it can be stressful in the long term for both. And I'm going to see, I've integrated a couple of little videos here. They're very, very brief, but I'm going to see if they play, because this is a little snippet of a resource that was developed and has been integrated into the e-learning just to kind of demonstrate what that might look like. Let me just see if this works.
I don't think we've got the audio.
No audio?
No audio. So I think it might be to do with headphones.
Might be to do with the setting. On my end, it's up as loud as it goes. Not working?
Well, it has got captions, so there's no sound.
Oh, let me turn that off. Okay, well, unfortunately, it doesn't seem as though my technology skills are quite up to scratch there today. So apologies for that. They're very brief videos that can kind of demonstrate that, but you probably have a bit of a sense of what's being referred to there anyhow. And certainly those resources are available on our YouTube website as well for you to have a look at. Sorry, but I do apologize for that, but I'll move on, because I'll talk a little bit more then about these dances and try to explain in a way that might make sense. And of course, I'm very willing to take questions and comments as well. This is another dance, again, very humanizing. We can all get caught up in these dances from time to time. This is the one where we dance separately, so it might be when you have the urge to step back or completely sit out for a while, or it may be that your loved one withdraws themselves and there's a separateness, kind of a distance going on. It may be that perhaps you're feeling drained and overwhelmed with your own struggles, perhaps, or something else is kind of going on where you don't feel as though you're able to do that stepping in right now. And again, that can be helpful in the short term, but in the long term, that might create some distance, and that might be a bit challenging. And there's a little video here, but again, I won't play it because I don't think it will be working similarly. But again, there's a little snippet available on our website and on our YouTube that can demonstrate that, and certainly is integrated into the e-learning as well. This is another carer dance, how we refer to them as sometimes I follow their lead. So this might be when we feel perhaps the urge really to do that stepping in that I spoke about before, and perhaps put our loved one's needs first and our own needs second. And that might be, again, really helpful in the short term, but in the long term, that might be really difficult to sustain. It might feel exhausting, and it might be a real challenge then for family members and carers to maintain their own well-being and have that space to be able to do that and prioritize it. And it may be that it might feel too risky to say no or put limits in place, or it may feel as though I can't do that for another reason. And the last one is we dance good enough. The idea here being, of course, we can't be perfect, and we might step in and out of these different dances from time to time, and that might be based on the situation, or it might be based on a slower change over time in the relationship. But this is kind of the one where we're able to both balance our own well-being, but also supporting our loved one. We're able to step in and be soothing and supportive and validating without kind of neglecting ourselves and losing ourselves within that relationship. And that, of course, this is what we're kind of aiming for, but recognizing we can't be perfect, and we can't kind of necessarily kind of sit there all the time. And naturally, as humans, we do kind of find ourselves in other relational patterns. But the idea here is, through this e-learning and through this resource, just taking the time to step back and think through what's helping, what's not helping, what's working and not working for both me and also for my loved one, can sometimes be a bit of a reset or a stop break for carers who sometimes may have found themselves in that fight, flight, freeze for a very long time. And the other part that I'll just introduce you to in the carer plan before I finish up is the idea of a carer plan. And this is certainly interwoven through the e-learning as well. The idea, of course, here that we can have a conversation perhaps with our loved one about what's working, what's not working, both in times of calm and in times of stress, so that we know what we might be able to encourage or how we might be able to respond. But in some relationships, that might, or for some families, that might not be possible. That might not be something the loved one is willing to step into right now, and that's okay. It's still, as a carer or as a support person, it's still valid for you to find opportunities to reflect on what's working and what's not working, and have a plan for yourself so that you feel grounded in making choices, especially when emotions are running high. Certainly, I know that Family Connections does a wonderful job in this space of assisting carers to be able to be skilled up when emotions are running high and crises are feeling hot. But the e-learning also tries to kind of integrate some of that with this carer plan and offers opportunities for thought processes in that space. And just some preliminary research, like, it's very small sample size, so you're more than willing to have a look and provide your feedback if you like. But I think it's still valuable to say that this e-learning has shown that it, family members are finding it helpful and that they're finding it satisfactory. And a lot are actually saying that they'd recommend it to someone that they know. But again, just really early days. And so in conclusion, just to kind of wrap up, yes, the field has improved significantly over the last 10 years, and that is wonderful, because family members and carers of people with personality disorders are important, and finding ways to best understand and best support family members and carers is certainly extremely important in the literature and also in the health service and broader kind of community as well. But we still have a long way to go. There's lots that we just don't know at this particular point. And part of that maturity in the field might be finding ways to provide a variety of different options to improve the flexibilities for carers to receive the support that they need at their level of intensity at this particular point in time. And that might include, for instance, the e-learning that we've developed, and it might not. And then again, viewing relationships as a dance might be helpful. That stepping in, stepping back and trying to navigate some of that can be useful to reflect on our own ways of being in the relationship, and developing a carer plan can help in times of both calm and stress, so that family members kind of feel grounded in knowing how they can best support their loved one. And so thank you for your time today, and I look forward to hearing your questions and your comments and your reflections, and I'll stop sharing so we can come back together. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. That was fantastic. It's so encouraging to see the structured way that you're addressing the needs of carers, because it is, having worked in the field, it's felt very ad hoc. So it's just great to see that there is, a systematic approach happening. Yeah, that was really, really great. So we did get some questions sent through beforehand, so I might start with those. And the sort of major themes that came up were around family members in terms of where the triangulation happens, because one parent gets it and the other parent doesn't get it, and how do you deal with that conflict, and also the impact on siblings. So there's one that's quite I'll read out two questions because they're quite similar. They're sort of cover different aspects of the same one. One, how can parents respond to siblings without BPD regarding the different expectations and standards of behaviours that end up occurring in a family where one child older has BPD and the other child doesn't, especially when the younger non-BPD child learns behaviour from the older child that is not okay, given that they don't have BPD. And it goes on a little bit. And then the other question was, the lived experience of my family is that the person with a personality disorder has traumatised others in the family very significantly, including younger siblings given different roles. There's an enmeshed same person sister and a scapegoated brother. Yeah, that's basically there's a couple of other versions of those questions.
Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you for those questions. I think it really speaks to the complexity that happens in families generally, but then when we add into the mixed personality disorder, things can really go awry. And I think this is speaking to, you know, how I mentioned very early on that there's a lot of PTSD. There's a lot going on in families. Not just with the primary support person, i.e. maybe it's the parent, but, you know, also thinking about siblings, younger siblings, even older siblings, that can really kind of get caught in the mix, and it's so challenging. I think my kind of comments around that are fundamentally, you know, that there's no magic answer to that, and I would love to be able to provide it. Certainly, if that's the situation that you're in, I do encourage you to go and get some individualized support, because families are so complex, and we do want to kind of support everyone in that family unit on a systemic kind of level. Certainly, for instance, as you mentioned, Jenny, you know, we can get very polarized in the ways in which we support someone with personality disorder. And those relationship dances can actually open a conversation about that. You know, we typically find perhaps one parent really steps in and tries to fix the problem. The other parent might be taking the approach of following their lead and kind of putting the other one's needs above their own. And actually bringing that out, if there's space to do so in the family, and having an open collaborative conversation about, well, where are you sitting and where am I sitting, just as kind of a default, and how can we actually come together to sit in a more kind of good enough space, can be a useful conversation. But it does need collaboration from kind of both, of course. So that can be really challenging. And then thinking about siblings, again, this is a space where we just don't know enough. The few siblings that have contributed to research, they have told us that it can be extremely challenging for them, extremely confusing. And they can kind of get caught up in very stressed family dynamics. And of course, we want to protect their well-being and their mental health as well. And I'd certainly encourage, where possible, for that sibling to get some support, like perhaps some their own individualized support, to be able to kind of navigate this difficult terrain, because it's a very difficult kind of conversation to have with siblings, where they can kind of see a bit of a disparity going on between kind of what's going on for their perhaps elder sibling and what's going on for me, and I'm acting it out and I'm getting different responses. So I don't know if that necessarily answers the question so much, but it just demonstrates the complexity.
Sure. And in talking about support, check out the BPD Foundation's list of resources, because there are a lot of free carer organisations, and you know, as an example, Helping Minds in Western Australia, that they will go to schools and see siblings. So they do counselling for carers, and that includes young people within a family system that are impacted by an older sibling or a younger sibling, or parents' mental health challenges. So, you know, hooking in with an agency like a carer-oriented agency is really useful, because they will know and understand how the resources in your state or in your city are functioning, and they can, you know, help direct you to find not only support for the person with a mental illness, but also support for all the carers within a family system.
And certainly to mention as well that you know, it's not, It's not necessarily an ideal circumstance around Medicare and what's available on offer in terms of psychological support, but there are mental health care plans that are available as well that can access and support psychology for that individualized support too. So you can get that through your GP for yourselves or for the sibling, as an example. And certainly that's not ideal. We would want more sessions to be available, of course, but that's a starting point perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is a common question that we get every webinar. You know, how does one take care of themselves when they're too fractured in the midst of a BPD episode, or to encourage DBT therapy if someone with BPD is dissociative and declining yet resisting therapy?
Yeah, really, really challenging kind of situations. That what I would say there is this again really speaks to, you know, the challenge that and from a human's perspective, I absolutely understand. You know, I have loved ones and certainly have supported them from, you know, during a variety of things. And when we are supporting loved ones, people that we love very dearly, of course, we're going to step into that, and that makes absolute sense. And then how do we actually find space for ourselves amongst all of that can be extremely challenging, especially if that's an enduring kind of thing that's going on, or it's kind of coming in waves and we can kind of get caught up in it. Certainly, I think this whole idea, again, I mentioned self-care, I think it's a really contentious thing, and certainly something I think that at times, you know, as people that support others, we can struggle with. But finding even 5 minutes a day, just 5 minutes, and what would you do with that? And just kind of actually scheduling that in with an alarm. I know that sounds like a simple solution. It's certainly not. But just 5 minutes as a breathing space might be something that you haven't had previously in that sort of space, and might actually lead to you feeling like as though at least, well, I've had 5 minutes today. And
That's
again,
actually, it's a DBT skill, isn't it?
That's right.
To take a vacation. So, you know,
Correct.
when you're in a chronic or crisis situation, it can feel like you're denying the reality if you take time out for yourself to do something nice, but you're not. You're refilling your well. You're taking a vacation from the problem, and that vacation is going to, you know, fill your tank so that you can, you know, deal with the ongoing problem. And that's something we teach people in DBT.
Yes, and it's that whole kind of analogy of, you know, when you're in an airplane, you probably heard this a million times, when you're in the airplane and, you know, suddenly the air dispenser comes down. You know, we're advised to put it on ourselves first, and then perhaps those that we're supporting, like children or people who aren't able to do it for themselves. Because if we don't do that and we're focusing on them, we perish. Like, we actually can't help others if we have an empty tank ourselves. And sometimes just holding that image in mind can be really useful too. And sorry, Jen, I've forgotten the second part of that question, which was around how to encourage, sorry, it's come back to me, how to encourage those to engage in treatment who perhaps are not so not wanting to at this point in particular time. Such a challenging kind of situation and question. My response to that is I don't think that there's any magic words that we can string together that's going to make that happen, unfortunately. But what we can control is ourselves and how we are taking care of ourselves. And this is where the whole idea of having a carer plan perhaps can be useful. And it might look like the sheet that I showed you. It might look very different for you. Certainly I've heard of people perhaps just putting together a collage or doing a drawing for themselves, or like, what actually can you do to take care of yourselves? What can you do when times are really kind of emotions are running really high? Both that support you, but also your loved one, and try to kind of generate a plan around that. Because if you have a plan in mind, it's going to be easier in some ways to be able to implement that when it feels like you need to. If we don't have a plan in place, it can feel like, again, fight, flight, freeze, and a little bit more chaotic.
Yeah, and even something that I recommend to people is Beyond Now's got a safety plan app for people that are feeling suicidal. But the thing is that it doesn't just have to be around suicidality. It can also be for your own carer plan. I am feeling so dysregulated right now. I can't think straight about how to take care of myself. Well, you can go to your app and, you know, it'll have a list of your favorite playlists. It'll have a list of people to contact, because I don't know if this happened to other people. When you're feeling isolated and overwhelmed, you don't remember who you can call. You know, so having that readily to hand can be really, really helpful. Which leads me to another question, which was around suicidality. Like, if, you know, how do you manage when people are threatening suicide?
Yeah.
And that's, you know, sort of, I guess the question is around parents being shaped to not hold limits because the threats of suicide come through.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a tricky situation. And this is, you know, this whole idea of it can feel too risky to put in limits, because if I do, things escalate and blow up and suddenly we're in crisis. The only things that I can kind of say to that without knowing individual kind of situations, of course, is we do need to take threats of suicide seriously, of course. And this is why having a plan in place can be really useful. Certainly, we speak sometimes in that intervention that I mentioned before, you know, that we can practice even putting that plan in place. And if our loved one is engaged with us, we can have conversations with them around perhaps we call it, like, what's the function of them threatening suicide? So we can understand the nitty gritty of it a little bit more, the nuance of it. But that's not to say that not to treat threats of suicide seriously. But certainly if you're feeling as though you're in this situation where every time I try to put a limit in place, everything's, you know, exploding, and suddenly we're threats of suicide, and now I feel like I can't put anything in place because I'm too anxious or worried and want the best for my loved one, but struggling to find a space for myself, that's when getting some support for yourself will be the most useful. Whether that's through family connections, whether that's through a carer organisation, whether that's through getting a mental health care plan and talking to a psychologist. The thing that I would suggest there is, where possible, to find someone who understands personality disorder, who understands the caregiving journey as well. And that can be a little, you know, needle in a haystack sometimes. If you're looking for psychologists, certainly there's a range of expertise, and that might not fit for many of them, for quite a few of them. But you will find some that are willing to sit with you and learn alongside you, even if they don't know it right now, and try to support you through that very difficult time.
Adding to that, Psychology Today, it's a commercial website, but it's very good in terms of, you can search for people that have got DBT experience. You can search on, you know, and that lists not just psychologists, but also counsellors. Never go for anyone that's not a PACFA registered counsellor, because we're not registered in the same way that psychologists are, so it's a bit more difficult to find the right people. But if they've got a PACFA registration, then they're legit. Which another question that we've got from the chat is, the financial burden is difficult and creates a lot of stress. Is there any support other than Centrelink for young adults if they can't work or live at home?
Oh, such a great question. And I unfortunately don't have all the answers to that one. I imagine that if you went to a carer organisation and spoke about those sorts of difficulties, they might have more information about what sort of resources and supports are available. Certainly, I was speaking to a organisation recently, and I don't know if I believe it was Australia-wide. I might be incorrect, so please take this with a grain of salt, called Carer Gateway. And they also provided a lot of support, including financial support to family members and carers, and they weren't of family members and carers of any description. So it could be physical illness, but it could be mental health concerns. It could be personality disorder. Like, they were actually very inclusive. But certainly I imagine that's only one of lots of different organisations that are able to provide some support, and might just be a stepping stone. So you might go to one and get some information and access some supports, but they might be able then to refer you to others to access other areas that they've identified, and you've identified collaboratively a gap that might be able to be filled.
And like an example of such a program is something like Youth Focus, which is a Western Australian charity, but they have a specific program for getting young people into work, because you know, like all the research that Andrew Channon's done out of Origin, that getting into work can actually be a very healing experience for people with BPD, because they build mastery. They get, you know, they have the responsibility, there's social connections there, you know, it's a new start for them. I'm not exactly sure what the research, how it identifies what is helpful, but we know that work is helpful, right? So finding an organisation, there are a lot of organisations now that will support people into getting into work. Being aware to do just enough and not too much, not to go into a full-time job necessarily, because that all or nothing kind of tendency can get them into trouble as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot of body of research at the moment, like the whole maturing of research around, you know, well, what is recovery? You know, and a lot of the research so far has been on symptom reduction. Like DBT does great in terms of reducing suicidality. But is that what people with lived experience actually want? They just want a reduction in their suicidality, or do they actually want improvements in their quality of life? And what would that look like for them? And this whole idea of love and work, you know, being able to lean into relationships that are mutually satisfying, being able to contribute in a way that's meaningful to them. So it might be employed work, but it might be volunteer work, or it might be something else. Like, what does that actually look like for those individuals is something that's a real interest at the moment in the field.
Do we have any more questions? I think we might have covered off most of the topics that have come through. We have a lot of questions about how to validate, but we've done quite a few. There are quite a few webinars there on validation out there, so I really encourage you to look at them. And just that dealing with an emotional, when someone's having a meltdown, I guess it's not too pejorative a term, you know, like when somebody's really emotionally dysregulated, how does one deal with that? Again, that's kind of individualized, isn't it, in the sense that a validation will work, but if someone's super dysregulated, it may just be that you need to remove yourself to be safe.
Yeah. Yeah, there's been some research, and the other webinars have probably touched on this. There's been a lot of research that if you validate someone's emotion, it actually comes down. It doesn't escalate the emotion. That validation can actually have a really soothing effect and bring the emotion dysregulation down. But just as we know from ourselves as having, you know, human brains, if we flip into fight, flight, freeze, sometimes no matter what anyone says, it just doesn't penetrate, because our brain actually flips into a different way of working when it's under that amount of stress, and its ability to take in that sort of information is quite impaired. And so that's the same for our loved one. The way that our brain gets dysregulated is very much on a human perspective. So it's very similar for our loved one as well. So when they're experiencing that extreme emotional distress, their fight, flight, freeze response also kicks in and changes the neurobiology of how their brain operates. And it means that their ability is also impaired to take in some of that information. So at times it actually might be beneficial if safety is a concern for yourself, you know, to remove yourself, or if safety is a huge concern for your loved one, to get them the emergency support that they require. But then, of course, validation is a really important skill, but perhaps, you know, just prior to when they're reaching that sort of level of distress. It's a little bit hard to get the, you know, the perfect touch point.
Yeah, and also to validate yourself in the midst of that as well. Before you validate anybody else, check in with yourself and say, what's going on for me here? Well, of course I'm feeling afraid right now, or oh, okay, there's some anger happening here. Well, you know, it is horrible to be name called, so that you can bring your own regulation down before you try to, you can't validate someone or regulate someone when you're not regulated yourself. we do have time because it's still only 1:15. I reckon I co-lead DB Teen, which is the family program, and so we teach parents or a parent equivalent and young people alongside each other. And the number one favourite skill is one called stop. Both parents and the young people name this as their favourite skill, because we ask at the end of the group always, what do people like best? And it's an acronym that there'll be in the links that I put through. I'll put you a link to the video that explains it again. But it's literally stop. Like, stop what you're doing. Don't say another word. Don't say another thing. Take a step back from the situation. Take a step back in your mind to what's going on and observe it and describe it. So using mindfulness skills to say, what's happening here? My person's really dysregulated. I'm feeling really dysregulated. Things are starting to happen. And then, so once you've described it, then P is proceed mindfully. And, you know, I think it's also really useful to know that without further stimulus, it takes, the Gottman's research shows it takes a woman about 10 minutes to come down from being very dysregulated without further stimulus. And for a man, it will take about 20 minutes. So it may be that the stop skill is going to be implemented for 10 to 20 minutes. And you might go off and do some self-regulation and invite them to go off and do some self-regulation. And then you can come back and proceed with a plan mindfully. That's the stop skill in a nutshell. But in the chat, I put a link through to DBT-RU's. The Rutgers University did a whole series of 5 to 10 minute explanations of all the DBT skills. And they're really fantastic. So jump on and check them out and check out the stop skill. And the mistake that people make with that skill is that they'll try and say to the other person, you need to stop, you need to do the stop skill. Very dysregulating for the other person. You can only use the stop skill on yourself. It may not be used on anybody else. It is only for you. And you can tell them what you're doing, and all of other family members can learn the skill, but you don't get to say it to another person. You only get to use it yourself. Do we have any other questions in the
Hi, Jenny. I see Amy has a hand up. I just wondered if Amy had a question.
Yeah, where's Amy? I don't, we can unmute. Sorry, Amy, you'll have to, I'm not sure if you can unmute yourself or put the question in the chats. We appear to have lost Amy. I'm not sure. I'm just trying. It relates to grief. Oh, there was a question about grief in here. Is it perhaps? Is there any research about BPD in older people, specifically dealing with grief and the loss of their main support partner? Was that the question? Yes. Okay. I think that was Amy's question. Sorry, I didn't ask that one.
Yep. So the person with BPD is an older person.
And they've lost a partner.
Yeah. Look, Amy, this is one of the areas broader in personality disorder that has not been researched enough. And it's something that at Project Air we're trying to lean into more, which is understanding the experience of older people with personality disorder, whether it's borderline personality disorder or any other personality disorder, and treatment. Like, there's been a big body of work in the adult space and a huge body of work happening now really positively in the younger person space, but not so much in the older adult space. And it can be really complicated. The very little that we do know is that it can be really complicated. And it can be complicated by a lot of things, you know, in terms of having lots of comorbidities in later life, you know, cognitive decline, physical kind of ailments now, also kind of perhaps being more in contact with health services in ways in which that they perhaps didn't want to be or didn't anticipate to be because of those sorts of kind of conditions and concerns. But of course, even those with personality kind of traits in the community might have gone for a very long time stabilized because they have had a loved one in their life. Maybe it's a partner who have offered that sort of support. And if that sort of support then, unfortunately, if they lose that support, of course, that's going to destabilize them as well, and their sort of personality struggles, but also the grief and loss that kind of comes along with that naturally, and how challenging that is. And certainly it's not an area that we've looked into enough as a community. And I can see in the chat you're putting things like it's leading to further isolation and retreating from the world. Yeah, because if someone has relied on an individual for a very long time to be their main soothing support person, and unfortunately that person passes away, that's a huge shock, regardless of age, regardless of personality disorder or not. But of course, it's going to be hugely impacted by those particular things too. And so there's no real and a very codependent relationship. Yeah, of course. So the stabilizing factor that's been going on for that individual over a long period of time has now been removed. And for some people, that's a partner. Perhaps for others, it might be that they've been in a job and they've retired and suddenly their life is up in the air, and that might be a destabilizing factor for them. So older adults and older life does come with a lot of different challenges. And yeah, so Amy, you're kind of feeling stuck perhaps in a position where you're not necessarily wanting to step in to be that primary support person, but you feel like you're being pulled in that particular direction, and she's struggling to access any counselling and things. The advice that I would give, again, it's a very hard place, absolutely. The advice that I would give in this situation, and of course knowing just the very tip of the iceberg, I imagine, is again, and this is going to probably sound very irritating, but again, is to seek some support for yourself. And I say that with compassion because I can understand how difficult a position and a place that would be, because of course you love this person, and yet you're feeling as though you're being pulled in a particular direction that doesn't feel helpful for you at this particular time. And it's good to hear that you have a lot of support in place. But I might even suggest kind of some professional support. Go and see a family member and care organisation, perhaps go and speak to a psychologist or counsellor that's particularly versed in this area. And yet those seem like simple solutions and like it's going to make the struggle easier, but it probably won't. It's probably going to be a very difficult kind of journey for you to navigate. And for anyone who is supporting someone who's an older person who has had that stabilizing support kind of removed from their life for whatever reason, and that, of course, all of those complexities that come along with it. So Amy, I don't know if I've answered your question to a degree, but certainly just acknowledging that's a very challenging situation, and all of these family stories that you've all been so generous and to share today, just recognizing that families are so complex and we're all doing the best that we can under very difficult circumstances. And the more that you can find some support for yourself during this time and spaces, whether it be physical spaces or time, just 5 minutes for yourself. That's kind of the advice that I can give at this point, but just recognizing the difficult situations that many people have shared that they're facing at the moment.
I think that's it for the questions. Thank you so much, Rachel. That was really Peter might have a question. I don't think we know how to turn off the mute, Peter, so you might need to put it into the chat.
Mute is off. Yeah.
Oh, okay, there you go. Right. Go ahead.
I had the opportunity a few years ago to meet with Dr. Marsha Linehan face to face over breakfast. And I had a chance to ask her this question, that we know that DBT is a very effective strategy for suicide prevention. And we know the conversational model is a good strategy for dealing with the ongoing effect of trauma or deep psychodistress. And the question I put to her was this, that when we do studies, we do studies of DBT versus conversational model, but has a study been done on the effect of sequentially DBT to get that ring fence safety in terms of a relief from mental health distress, and then conversational model to look at the ongoing effect of trauma, so that one followed by the other might be the better combination of treatment.
And what did Marsha say, Peter?
What Marsha Linehan said was, she said, it's not a piece of work at the time. This is a few years ago. It's not a piece of work that she had seen being done, but she said she would like to see it done, because the way DBT is taught here, at least in the part of Sydney or near Sydney where I am, it's kind of like when the program's finished, the person who's finished the program, it's almost like they've graduated and they're sort of, there you are, off you go, you're on your own.
Yes.
And they're still left with things unresolved, unsupported, incomplete, and that there may be some benefit in looking at DBT followed by conversational model at a suitable interval. I just want to know if has anyone done that work?
It's a great question, and I'm so glad you proposed it to the Queen of DBT herself. So hopefully you planted a seed there for some research for her to do. Look, I don't know of any of that research happening. That's not to say that it's not, but I don't know of any of it happening. Certainly when you are trained in DBT, you do learn that there are phases of DBT, and the first kind of phase is you're trying to get that stability in terms of reducing suicidality and the self-harm, and then it kind of goes on, and then the last kind of DBT phase is really trying to edge into looking at that kind of complex idea of what recovery might look like for an individual, what love and work might look like for them. Certainly in my clinical practice, I have been aware of clients that dip in and out of different treatment options. So they might find lots of benefit in DBT at one time, and then they might edge into others at other times that might offer them something different. And there's lots available. There's DBT and conversation model, there's transference focused therapy, mentalization based therapy, schema focused therapy, and it's about finding the therapist and the type of therapy that works for you at that point in your journey. And that might be, as you say, Peter, for some people, it might be DBT at that point in their journey, and then later on, it might be something else. It's a great question, though.
Thank you. Well, I think we're coming up to the half hour, so I just want to really, really thank Rachel for all her sharing of her knowledge and expertise, and I guess the hope that comes from knowing that there is a structured sort of recognition of carers' needs and also, I really hope someone does do some research into the impact on the person with BPD when their carers become more skillful and emotionally regulated themselves. Just wanted to raise people's awareness of the next webinar, which also answers a question that was posed around how do you maintain hope, because it's being presented by two carers of someone with BPD and sort of talking about their journey. And I think that's a major source of hope when you see some other people that have experienced what you may be experiencing now, and they've come out of the tunnel and found their way through. So that will be our next webinar. That's going to be on July 24th. Just a reminder for people that are watching the recording that if you're watching the recording, you can still donate. There will be a link either in the comments or perhaps on the screen now. We get really technical. And just because we really need that ongoing support. And if you ever get chat to an MP or a person in a health department, just remind them that carers need support too, and that there are programs that need to be funded more. Otherwise I think that's it. I think we can stop recording, and again, just a big round of applause to Rachel for a really great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. It's been my absolute pleasure. Wishing you all the very, very best. And thank you all for your time and your questions and your contributions today. I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to be here and share some time with you this morning.